a living history production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, Battle Walks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to Battle Walks.
Hello and welcome to Battle Walks, where once again it's a delight to walk across some of the world's great battlefields. As always, I'm joined by battlefield historian Pete Smith. Pete, great to be back here again walking another wonderful battlefield.
Hi Matt, yep, looking forward to it.
This week we're heading north. We were on the Somme last week and now we're heading up into Belgium, still on the Western Front from the First World War, but in the Belgian sector of the battlefields. And most people don't even realise, I think, a lot of people don't realise that Belgium played such an important role in the battlefields. They think the Western Front only ran through France, but Belgium is a really wonderful country and has a pretty special place in my heart, particularly when it comes to visiting the battlefields of the Western Front.
Interestingly, Matt, I'll just dive in there. Of course, Belgium wasn't a name that was actually used. It was France and Flanders, F and F. So that's why we don't really talk about Belgium much, because it kind of comes under the generic of Flanders.
It's a fascinating region, Pete. It was one of the first regions I went to when I visited the Western Front many years ago, and it's an essential site. I mean, not just the country of Belgium, I'm talking about the section of Flanders where the trenches of the First World War ran through, most notably around the town of Ypres. It's an absolutely fascinating site and quite different from the Somme battlefields, isn't it?
Oh, it is indeed. I mean, historic. It's from a point of view of being British English. Then it's an area that Marlborough fought over, and in the 100 Years' War. So it's soaked in history. Sadly, of course, a lot of it will be destroyed. The physical remains of it will be destroyed in the First World War. But a historic area. I mean, it's fantastic. And Ypres is a beautiful, beautiful city.
So the reason we're even here is that the Germans tried to capture the city of Ypres and were unsuccessful. They entered it briefly in 1914, but for the rest of the war, they never succeeded in capturing it. And what that meant was a bulge formed in the British front line around the town of Ypres. And in military terms, a bulge is a salient, and so this is the famous Ypres salient, and just a ghastly killing field. Probably the most famous battle that occurred here was the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, but just an absolute killing field in this confined space. And today we're going to talk about one of the 1917 battlefields. It's important for Australians, it's important for New Zealanders, it's important for British. It's Polygon Wood, and it's a site that was noticeable on trench maps of the time, a fairly prominent landmark at the time. And today is very noticeable as well because the wood has been replanted and it is there much as it was in 1917. So Pete, why don't you give us again a little bit of one of your insightful historic overviews about why there was fighting in this area at all?
Well, the Germans, again, are trying to reach the coast. They're pushing back the Belgian army, which is falling back fairly rapidly. The British are moved in to try and assist. And the fighting in that winter of 1914-15 around the town is an attempt to hold the Germans there to stop them from getting to the coast and taking any more of the of Belgium or France. And in fact, there is very little of Belgium left, really. Belgium has been kind of squished into a tiny corner. The Belgian army holding the area nearer to the coast, an area that is prone to flooding and has been deliberately flooded to make it difficult for the Germans to cross. And the British army has managed to stop the Germans in the town of Ypres. But it's not ideal because there is a series of ridges that run around the town, and we are trying to hold the Germans from those ridges in 1914. So in 1914, the fighting comes to the outskirts of Ypres, and the very heavy fighting in Polygon Wood, actually, in 1914. So the wood is very damaged very early on in the war. But we're going to hold the Germans in that winter of 14-15. But sadly, in the May of 1915, we will actually be forced off the ridges and back nearer to the town. The number of battles around Ypres means that we have the First Battle of Ypres, the Second Battle of Ypres, the Third Battle of Ypres, the Fourth Battle of Ypres, and in fact the Fifth Battle of Ypres, which is the final, forcing the Germans away and on their way back to eventually to the armistice. So this is now we're going to be discussing the Third Battle of Ypres, which is really the first two. Battle 1 is stopping the Germans and holding them. Battle 2 is again trying to stop them, but actually failing and being forced back. And Battle 3, the Third Battle of Ypres, which we now normally know as Passchendaele, is our turn. We are now forcing the Germans back up onto the ridges and then eventually over the ridges. And so Polygon Wood sits firmly in all of this, and it's on one of the ridges on the right-hand side of the town as we look towards the German lines.
The thing that I always point out to people is that the Battle of Passchendaele in October 1917 was an absolute disaster for the British and caused a huge number of casualties for little ground gained. But the bit that we don't often understand is in the preceding months, there were a number of attacks. That Passchendaele was just really the final effort in a whole series of attacks that made up the Third Battle of Ypres. And the early stages of this battle were actually very, very successful, and Polygon Wood sums that up, doesn't it?
It's one of the sad aspects, I think, of the naming this battle now has become known as Passchendaele, and it's something that I try and avoid, and even if I can't avoid it, I explain the difference between Third Ypres, which is the actual overall name of the battle, and Passchendaele, which is in fact only that last phase in the October and November of 1917. And you're absolutely right that the battles before that, of which Polygon Wood is part of it, the Menin Road and eventually Broodsind, 3 battles which are not really that well known. Perhaps Polygon Wood is the most known, but the fighting of the Menin Road and the Battle of Broodsind, all 3 of them successes, with heavy casualties, you have to say, but successfully pushing the Germans back. And then we get to Passchendaele, and everybody remembers Passchendaele, the disaster, the casualties, the mud, the horror of it all. And in fact, I think it's a little demeaning to all of the men who fought very hard and very successfully in those battles leading up to that final phase, the actual Battle of Passchendaele.
Well, we should talk a little bit about tactics here as well, because they changed quite significantly. The British had learnt some very important lessons on the Somme fighting in the previous year, and we now have this idea of what they called a bite and hold attack, which the Germans had changed their defensive position as well. The Germans in the mud and the Flanders soil realised that continuous straight trench systems were quite difficult to defend. And so the Germans had adopted this system of defence in depth, where they'd built mutually supporting pillboxes and trenches and a very deep and broad system of defences. And that would require a very different type of tactics to capture those positions. So tell us about the change of attitude in the British forces that would be attacking here in 1917.
Well, the change in tactics are enormous. One of the latest developments, of course, was the tank in 1916, 15th of September. It came into action, but actually it's not ideal here. The tank doesn't really make a lot of sense in a landscape that is so boggy and so waterlogged, which is in the main the landscape around Ypres, that salient is waterlogged. But the great change, the really important change, is because artillery is king in the First World War. If you've got the right type of artillery, it's in the right place, it's got good gunners, it's able to pinpoint its targets and hit its targets. And the change in tactics, this creeping barrage, I mentioned it briefly in a previous podcast that for the Battle of the Somme, the early phases, we didn't have the creeping barrage. We now have this creeping barrage, which basically means that the infantryman, as he stands up, if all's going well, then he walks behind a barrage of shells that move forward at the same pace that he's moving. So we have that for this action, the fighting in Polygon Wood, and it works particularly well. And the infantryman himself, no longer are we having lines of men, the whistle blows and they go over in straight lines. We now have men working in small groups, in arrowhead formations, artillery formation, rushing forward, covered by Lewis guns that are right in with the infantry, incorporated into their tactics, heavier machine guns, the Vickers firing over their heads. So all of this is starting to come together. And the bite and hold aspect of it means we don't always overreach ourselves. So we break down a battle, the larger battle, the Third Ypres, we break it down into these little phases where all we need to do here, and this is a prime example, is take Polygon Wood and the surrounding landscape. It isn't just an Australian action. We very often think this is just an Australian action, but we have British divisions fighting here as well. But it is mainly the Australian 5th Division and 4th Division that are going to be involved in taking the wood and the side of the wood. And that's the important part, taking the wood. Now, the other thing I need to talk about is the wood itself. It's one of those misnomers of the First World War. We talk about fighting in woods. Polygon Wood being no difference. There was very little wood there. And any wood that was there was really smashed to smithereens. Partly due to this bombardment prior to the assault, but also due to the fighting that we know that took place in 1914. The wood was very badly damaged and smashed up in 1914. So by 1917, when we're fighting there in this Battle of Polygon Wood, then there is little wood about, really. It's more just a smashed landscape.
And the key feature, of course, of all of the fighting during the Third Battle of Ypres was the pillbox fighting, where the Germans had this defence in depth. They had machine gun crews stationed in and around these huge concrete blockhouses, and the way that the troops were attacking those was to fire on them and then charge forward against very heavy machine gun fire. So again, imagine the horror of trying to fight a war in those conditions, where you're seeing your mates get killed all around you. You eventually charged, captured this concrete pillbox. The Germans at that point would often surrender, and as you can imagine, prisoners were often not taken. Just a horrific way to fight a war in this part of the battlefield, Pete.
I think the difficulty here is taking prisoners. We often think about this, how terrible it is that they didn't take prisoners. But in a landscape that is smashed to smithereens, that is like the craters of the moon, and then add the water in and the rain and the misery, and that most of these actions are now taking place in the dark. Trying to hang on to prisoners and look and keep them, because you have to. If you take somebody a prisoner, you have to supposed to keep him safe and eventually move him to the rear. But you haven't got the men to do that. You haven't got the will to do it. It's just very difficult. It's easier, sadly, just to dispose of them and carry on. And you have to say, it's not just us that are doing it. The Germans are doing exactly the same. And also what you have to be aware of is one of the German tactics was this elastic defence where they wouldn't panic. If we broke into their lines and we captured a couple of their pillboxes, all they would do is gather themselves and then counterattack very, very strongly. And so we had to be aware that this was coming, always, that when we took one of these pillboxes, the first thing you have to do is try and reverse it, try and get it sorted out so it aids you and not your enemy any longer.
Well, the pillboxes will feature pretty prominently in this walk that we're going to do. So let's begin the walk, Pete. So we're starting at a place that I think everyone who visits this area of the battlefield should go to. It's Café de Drève, or also known as Anzac Rest, and it's a cafe on the edge of Polygon Wood. So we've driven out of the town of Ypres, we've followed the signs into the village of Zonnebeck, we've turned right in the village of Zonnebeck and headed out to Polygon Wood. We've driven past the length of Polygon Wood. We'll come back and walk through it later in the tour. And we're going to stop at the cafe down on the corner. And Café de Drève, run by Johan van der Waal, who is a very good friend to Australia and to British people as well, because he's done a lot to preserve the memory of the troops that fought and died here. And I've known Johan for many years, and just a really fascinating bloke. Tell us about your encounters with Johan.
Johan is fantastic. I don't think I know anybody on the battlefields that lives and breathes the battlefields as much as Johan does. He was brought up with it. He has always lived on the battlefields. From a very young man, he's been keen. He was in a group known as the Diggers for a long time, who explored underground tunnels and dug out bunkers and things. So he's an absolute aficionado. The knowledge he has is extraordinary. One of the hardest parts with Johan is trying to stop him talking. And when you're on a battlefield tour and you're trying to take a battlefield tour, then it's quite difficult. But it's because he's so enthusiastic, so I don't mind letting him run on a little bit. He also has a very good private museum in the upstairs, the attic of his little cafe, which he's very happy to let people go and have a wander around. And it has a lot of the relics that he's found over the years. And in recent years, he's been raising a memorial known as the Brothers in Arms Memorial, because he also was called in, and is regularly still called in, when they find the remains of soldiers on the battlefield. We always imagine that the Commonwealth War Graves does all the work, but in fact, the Commonwealth War Graves recovers the remains. They don't do any kind of archaeological work, and so it's left to others, and Johan has been involved in very many recoveries, and perhaps the most famous known as the Zonnebeck 5, which we will talk about later, who were 5 Australians that he recovered. The interesting aspect of that is that one of those chaps was buried by his brother, and it hooked Johan and upset him a little as well, and he just became obsessed with it, and eventually he has raised a memorial to brothers, which is nearing completion, very close to the cafe that where we're standing at the moment. So yeah, he's a great guy and well worth a chat, and certainly if you arrive here independently and want some information, then he's just a great source of information.
Well, that's exactly what happened to me the first time I visited the battlefields more than 20 years ago. I called in there to find out a little bit more about Polygon Wood, and Johan ended up taking me on a bit of a private tour of the wood. So that was back in the days when I was just a skinny kid who knew nothing about the war. It was really wonderful to meet Johan. But you mentioned the Zonnebeck 5. I should talk a little bit more about my connection with them as well, because in 2007, I was in Belgium making a documentary about an archaeological dig that was taking place on some nearby trenches. And in just casual conversation with Johan, he mentioned that the year before he'd uncovered these Australian bodies on the battlefield and that they were now going to be DNA tested. And that was the first time that DNA was used and was successful in identifying 3 of the 5 Australian soldiers. And so that became the basis for the documentary that I made in 2007 called Lost in Flanders. And it still pops up from time to time. I think you can find it on the internet, and it still pops up on the ABC from time to time. But that tells the story of the discovery of these 5 bodies, and Johan plays a very important role in that. So I always feel very indebted to Johan, and it was a wonderful connection. I was not involved in the identification of the soldiers. That was through people much more talented than I was, but it was a real privilege to be able to tell that story during the making of this documentary. So look out for that documentary, Lost in Flanders, and you'll get to see Johan doing his thing, being enthusiastic on the battlefields, which is what he does best. But certainly call into the cafe. Johan will be there behind the bar, have a cold beer, say hello, and he'll regale you with stories of the battlefields and see the museum. It's really a great place to stop, get some context for Polygon Wood before we head off into the wood. But that's what we're now going to do. We're now going to walk down from the western edge of the wood where we are at Johan's cafe. We're going to walk down to the southwest corner of the wood to what's known as Blackwatch Corner. Pete, tell us about Blackwatch Corner.
Well, Blackwatch Corner, I've known it, and everybody knows it as Blackwatch Corner. And I suppose, like a lot of names, certainly battlefield names, you don't really think about it a great deal. I knew the Australian story there, but I have to say the 1914-15 story had not been one that I was overly conversant with for a long, long time. And a few years ago, they started putting in the base of what was obviously going to be a memorial. And I remember looking at it with interest and thinking, was this going to be an Australian memorial, or what was it going to be? And it is the most stunning, probably, I think, one of the, if not the greatest depiction of a Scottish soldier that I've ever seen, certainly on the battlefield. Enormous, great, oversized bronze memorial to the Black Watch, a Scottish regiment, and it's commemorating them on the Western Front in their entirety, but more specifically to the fighting that took place on the 10th and 11th of November in 1914 as they hurled back the Prussian Guard. So they view it as one of their greater actions of the Great War. So this enormous great bronze of a Scottish kilted soldier, rifle and bayonet at the port, facing the oncoming Prussian Guard. So yeah, stunning memorial. So it's commemorating the fighting of 1914-15, not the Australians fighting there in 1917, but a great place to stop and a great place to be able to kind of have a good look at the wood, because one of the rides, the central ride that runs right the way down the wood, actually starts there as well. So it's a really good place to start entering the wood and starting to envisage what was going on here in 1917. Of course, we haven't mentioned the date yet. The date of this action is the 26th of September in 1917.
And during that attack at Blackwatch Corner, a couple of very important Australian things occurred there as well. Most notably, the story that I always find really gripping is that the tale that as the Australians advanced before the attack and captured this area, there was a double-storied German pillbox there, a machine gun post, which the Australians successfully captured. But the account is that the men in the top level of the pillbox did not appreciate that their comrades on the ground level had surrendered, and so they kept fighting. And an Australian officer was Frederick Moore, Captain Frederick Moore, was then killed by a machine gun fired from the top level after the Australians had thought the Germans had surrendered. And as you can imagine, this was considered absolute treachery from the Australians. And the account I read said that they would have slaughtered the entire German garrison if not for the intervention of another Australian officer who stopped them from just the slaughter of the German garrison. So again, the fog of war, Pete, the confusion that goes on, it's very difficult to know what's happening on a battlefield. It could simply have been one German machine gunner decided he wasn't going to surrender. It could have been a group of German machine gunners who didn't realise that their comrades had surrendered and fought on. Just, again, the terrible small tales that we hear all the time on the battlefields.
I think that's the difficulty in fighting. You have to remember that most of this fighting from the Battle of the Somme, the later phases of the Battle of the Somme in 1916 onwards. Most major attacks take place in the dark, and this one is a night attack. So it's very difficult. I served in the military, and I haven't seen combat, but certainly a lot of exercises in the dark, and it is very difficult to try and figure out what's going on all the time. And so when you are in combat and your adrenaline's up and you're faced with Germans, I mean, how on earth can you tell? How can the Germans tell whether the people have surrendered, whether they're supposed to surrender, what on earth's going on? And so I think you can understand the difficulty that men had. Equally, there were men who would not surrender and will fight to the end no matter what, even if they're ordered to surrender. Now, on both sides, you get men of equal caliber who have just made a decision at the beginning of this war that they will not be taken and they will fight to the end no matter what.
It's also near this point that a young bloke called Paddy Bugden won the Victoria Cross. Unfortunately, posthumously, he was killed in the action that he was eventually awarded the Victoria Cross for. But Paddy Bugden, a great story, a private, but taking on pretty much the Germans single-handedly and responsible for really helping his battalion advance during this tough fighting at Polygon Wood.
I think it's interesting here as well, isn't it? That part of his VC citation is yes for taking in bunkers and killing Germans, but also for rescuing his own men. And again, I think that starts to allow you to understand the confusion of what was going on. Is that a single man suddenly noticed that there were a group of Germans taking Australian prisoners back behind the lines, and he was able to rush them and to kill them and scare them off and free these Australians. So again, it shows you the intermingling of the actions that were going on at the time and the confusion. But yeah, a fantastic VC citation and a real fighting VC, sadly, that will cost him his life. But he was extraordinary on that day, extraordinary.
So the other important thing to note about Blackwatch Corner as we're standing here is this is effectively the start point for the attack. So the Australian lines stretched across the wood, and this is roughly where the Australians began their attack from. And again, the description, you talked about the rolling barrage and how important that was, the creeping barrage to protect the troops. And I love Charles Bean's description in the official history where he described it as the most perfect that ever protected Australian troops. And he said it rolled forward like a Gippsland bushfire in front of the Australian troops. And we should remember at this time as well, it had been a warm summer and the ground was not as boggy as it was going to become when the rains arrived in time for the Battle of Passchendaele. So it was dusty, it was dry, and this creeping barrage was absolutely perfect, just shielding the troops as they advanced, which effectively was the only way to capture these German defensive positions.
It's described, isn't it, as the dust was intermingled with the smoke and the gas that was being used, and it just became a fog. And you can imagine, and this is in the dark, so on top of it being dark, you've then got this enormous kind of cloud of dust and gas and smoke that is moving forward in front of you and that you're having to fight through. Gives me the heebie-jeebies, to be honest. It really would have been very, very difficult. And direction is one of the things that's a problem. And I think it's described that officers who are commanding here had to take their compasses out and actually get compass bearings to keep the advance going because it was so thick. The dust and the smog and the dark made it so difficult. They were using compass bearings for the advance.
Not to mention the noise. Imagine the noise of that barrage falling down. It's the one thing I think those of us who've been fortunate never to have been in combat just cannot comprehend, particularly when we talk about the First World War and the scale of the artillery fire. The noise would have been absolutely deafening. It's unsurprising that all those old veterans that we met in our youth were always a bit hard of hearing. I'm never surprised by that because of just the sheer cacophony that would have been occurring during these great battles.
I've been involved in a couple of firepower demonstrations in the past when I was serving, and certainly to have the kind of the artillery and the mortars coming over you and every gun firing at the same time. That's the whole point, is to try and show how much fire you can put down. Deafening. It is absolutely, and that's without anybody firing back at you. Absolutely deafening. You can't hear yourself speak.
Just extraordinary. I think there's no way we can comprehend just the scale of the destruction and the noise and the horrific sight that it would have presented from both sides. No wonder men ran from the battlefield. But you mentioned the word ride before, that there's a ride that leads from Blackwatch Corner to the Butts, which is the main feature of Polygon Wood. What's a ride, Pete?
Yeah, a ride is it's an old term. It's been used for, I suspect, centuries, and it goes back to the kind of baronial homes of people that are the landed gentry. And it's interesting that the same term is used in Belgium, in the UK as well. And a ride basically is a gap in the woods. So if you plant a wood, you put these rides going through it, and literally that's what they're for. They were for the landed gentry to go out for a ride in the morning, and they would follow these woods. Secondary use, of course, is fire breaks. They were used as fire breaks. If you had a fire in one part of the wood, then it allowed that to be fought and to not cross into another section of the wood. So yeah, woods, generally speaking, planted wood plantations will have rides, these gaps in them that you can use.
And we should mention that point as well, that the reason the wood is even here was it was replanted in the 1920s after the war. It was, as you said, completely destroyed, and then the wood was completely replanted, which is why it's still there in the original shape from before the First World War.
Yeah, it's replanted as most woods were. It was something that certainly the French and the Belgians, I think, followed, that they wanted their countryside, their landscape, putting back as it had been. And woods were a big part of the landscape, and so nearly all the woods are put back exactly the same as they have been. And in fact, this is, anybody wonders what kind of trees we have growing here, they're predominantly pine trees. It's a pine wood that has some deciduous trees, oaks and elms and things around the outside, beeches especially around the outside of it, but in the main it's pine. And it's still a worked wood. It's something that a lot of people kind of don't realise. They think a wood is just a wood, but it's there for a reason. And the reason here is that the trees are harvested. Not in bulk, so they don't take whole areas. They will just select trees throughout the wood and take out a few trees every year. So you can normally spot them. They've got a big red mark on them. That means that tree's doomed. It's going to be removed.
Well, we're going to walk along that main ride, which leads from Blackwatch Corner to the Butts New British Cemetery, which is at the far end of the wood, and you will see it from the moment you enter the wood. You can look down along this very long, wide track that leads the entire length of the wood to this cemetery at the far end. But I should say as well, grab a copy of my book, Walking with the Anzacs, if you want to walk in our footsteps on this, because there are a number of other sites to see in the wood that we're not going to include on this virtual walking tour. But if you take a right, for example, on the first path you come to in the wood and walk down there, you'll find the remains of a German pillbox captured by the Australians. There's several other German pillboxes that are scattered throughout the woods, so it's well worth exploring. There's the remains of trenches. It's quite a remarkable place, Polygon Wood, and as I said, I still have fond memories of it being one of the first battlefield sites I visited, if not the first battlefield that I visited the first time I came to the Western Front. Just extraordinary. But we're going to continue along the main road down through the woods, the haunting woods, Pete. It is a haunting place when you walk through there and imagine you're walking in the footsteps of the Australians from over a century ago, and how many of them were killed or wounded in the ground very near to where you're now walking.
And probably still, there will still be unrecovered bodies around us. So it's one of the things we always have to remember, especially when you're in these wooded areas, that the men are still here. Quite often, they'll all be around us. A number of the missing, they were not recovered. Again, I always have to kind of enforce this with people, or reinforce it, is the fact that this was not a wood when the Australians were moving through here. This was shattered timber at the best, and the landscape of the moon at the worst. So it's not a wood, even though we talk about it. So yes, they're scrambling over woods. Actually, there was an issue here. It meant that if you did have to go to ground, you couldn't really dig here very easily because of the roots that were everywhere. And so normally you just used the shell holes that had been created, and there were a lot of those here as well. But it is very moving. Being in that wood, and there's something about woods that just makes you think more. You can't see a great deal. And so I suppose that is what the soldiers experience, is that lack of vision, lack of being able to see what is coming up. The one thing they could see always is this butt, this mound. And it's their final objective, really, is to get to the butt. It's at the far side of the wood. And it's visible. It was visible from almost everywhere, so long as you could see it. And of course, a lot of the guys wouldn't be able to see it until they actually got right almost on top of it. But it's a very big mound. It's man-made. And it was the backstop of a rifle range. That's where we get the term a butt, the butts. Here it's a boot, spelt slightly different, but it's the backstop of a rifle range, because prior to the Great War, there had been this rifle range in the middle of the wood. And to stop these newfangled rifles, when they developed the rifles rather than the musket, the bullets travelled a lot further. They decided they needed to have some backstop, and so they built this mound to stop the bullets. And the Germans will utilise it as an observation from the top of it, but also they will hollow it out and fill it with concrete and make it into a fortified position. position. So it's the final objective for the Australians moving through the wood. And it's visible, as we discussed, right the way from when you first start walking up this ride, you can see it at the end.
Well, we're going to keep walking through the woods, and probably for about half a kilometre or so. And eventually on our left, we're going to come to a small path which takes us off the main track and then leads to one of the most extraordinary sights you'll see anywhere in this region, a huge bunker called Scott's Post, which was captured by the Australians during that advance on the 26th of September 1917. Pete, the first time I saw this thing, and still every time I see it, every time I take a group there, every time I visit it, it's massive. There's 2 huge rooms on each side. It has damage all over it from shell fire during this attack and indeed during the entire war. Just an extraordinary relic left over from the fighting.
It's also one that used to be quite difficult to find. I'm sure you've experienced it, and I know
Absolutely.
I certainly have, is that the path has now been improved and it's well marked now, so you can't really miss it. But in the old days, it was just people walking there that sort of made it visible. But quite often, as I was walking and talking, I'd be kind of half panicking and thinking, have I gone past it? Have I gone past it? Because you can't see it. It also gives you an idea of how easy it was to camouflage things, that you cannot see this enormous blockhouse until you're almost on top of it. An interesting aspect of it, it is damaged, and it's damaged on one side where you'd expect it to be damaged. On the side that was facing the Australian advance, it's terribly damaged, not penetrated by any shells, but you can see it being hit over and over again by shells. But the major damage to the left-hand side, and the left-hand side it's broken into 2 sections, 2 halves, so it's effectively one blockhouse but with 2 sections. The left-hand section is terribly damaged. And that damage is actually post-war, and it's a way of they attempted to get rid of them by filling them with munitions that had been collected in the area and then detonating it and hoping that they would remove the blockhouse as well as the munitions. In this case, it hasn't worked. It's just kind of spread one side of it a little, but you still get it's still almost complete, so you get the idea of what it was like. And what you can obviously see is that it had steel doors on it. They're no longer there. They'll have been salvaged for scrap, but you can see that where the fittings would have been, steel doors and gas doors. These things were self-contained. If you could get in and shut the door and hold out, then the hope would be that in a counterattack you would be rescued. So that's the choice you had always when you were defending one of these blockhouses, was do I run or do I stay with it and hope that somebody's going to come and get me?
The thing that I think is most extraordinary about this pillbox, well, among many things that are extraordinary about it, is that on the front side, where all the shell damage is there's a perfect hole where you can see the nose cone of probably a field artillery shell, where the shell has dug into the concrete, and there's a perfect circle where the nose cone is, and then the thing's exploded. There's like the shape of the shell.
It's almost like a fossil mark, isn't it?
It's incredible.
Yeah, it is.
And you can put it's the size of your fist, but you can see the shape of the shell that gouged out the huge chunk of concrete on what was a remarkable hit from the field gunners, a direct hit on the pillbox. But this was captured by the 56th Battalion, the Australian Battalion, during the advance on the 26th of September. And you talked about the steel doors and the Germans inside. At the point where they realised they were surrounded, I just love this quote from the 56th Battalion War Diary, where they said that the Germans, after they realised they were surrounded, emerged from the bunker like whimpering boys holding out armfuls of souvenirs. And the great aspect of the Australian souvenir hunters was the idea of getting a helmet or a watch from a German prisoner was something that drove the Australians quite fiercely. And the Germans knew it as well. And as the young garrison emerged, absolutely terrified, into the arms of the waiting Australians, they held forward these souvenirs for them in hopefully some sort of a peace offering, so that they wouldn't be killed. And this was one of the places where prisoners were taken. The garrison was captured and sent back to the Australian lines.
There's an interesting aspect about the taking of this blockhouse. We haven't actually mentioned it. I don't think we mentioned its name. It's known as Scott's Post. And there is a little plaque to the side of it that commemorates Scott and his men. And I've always been slightly confused because we have Lieutenant Colonel Scott commanding the battalion that took the blockhouse here. He would die a few days later, and he's buried in the cemetery that we're going to walk to. But the name that's on the side of it, somebody just put a private memorial plaque is to a Scot who is a second lieutenant and has been awarded the MC. And I just couldn't understand and figure out what was going on. And it is only recently that I've realised that they are actually brothers, and they both fought here in the battle. So Lieutenant Colonel Scott, who will be killed a few days later and is buried in the cemetery. It was his brother that was involved in the actual taking of the blockhouse, and he survives the war, survives the Great War, and is commemorated on the blockhouse himself.
And also, there's some trenches in this area too, aren't there? Not a lot of trenches in the wood, but there are some in this area as well.
You can very clearly see the trench from the ride going to the blockhouse. Well, not clearly. You have to kind of squint slightly, but you can once you've got the hang of it and you can see where it is, and then it's easier to follow it from the ride. You can follow it zigzagging all the way to the blockhouse, and you realise it was the route from the ride to the blockhouse. There was a zigzagging trench. So yeah, they're mainly filled in. There's an interesting aspect here that within woods in France, they didn't tend to fill in the trenches and the shell holes. They just replanted the trees and the wood grew, and they thought no point in filling everything in. So you always get a slight inkling of the battlefield in France if you walk into a wood that was on the battlefield. In Belgium, sadly, they tended to level the landscape and then plant the trees, so you don't get that insight quite as much as you do in France. But here, just occasionally, you can see the trenches. They're very shallow. You can get just a little divot in the ground almost, but you can follow them here.
That's another important point to make as well, is even though these blockhouses stood often in isolation as an obstacle to the attacking troops, you think, well, the Germans had to get into them. They couldn't cross the open battlefield to get into them. So they were joined and linked by an intricate system of trenches, which enabled the Germans to stay safe and move between them. And as you say, you can occasionally still see those trenches leading to the blockhouses. So a couple of other important little pillboxes we should mention here, Pete. I'm sure anyone listening to this who has walked through Polygon Wood or anyone who attempts this walk will discover this, the famous New Zealand shelters in Polygon Wood. Now, not far from Scott Post, if you continue along and walk towards the cemetery at the far end of the ride, in the wood on the left are two very small, low bunkers that were built by New Zealand troops who occupied this sector in 1918. And they're fascinating. They're tiny little shelters, and described as holding 8 men each, which I think is remarkable when you see the size of them, Pete. But I think something even more remarkable is how absolutely bloody impossible they are to find today. So I think we should have some sort of award system that we give someone a badge of honour for anyone that can find the New Zealand shelters in Polygon Wood. So if you're the adventurous type, take that as your challenge to try and locate the New Zealand shelters. How do you go finding them, Pete, whenever you take a group there?
I don't. I failed miserably a couple of times with my groups, and it tends to be the time of year. If the brambles and the nettles and the wild growth is high, very difficult to see, very difficult to find. If it's winter and everything's died back, easier. So it depends on the time of year. I now, generally speaking, don't attempt it if it's in the summer, because I know there's a chance I may fail.
I do mention them in my book, but I do say that they are very difficult to find. So, yeah, see that as your challenge. If you're listening to this and you want to go and try and find those New Zealand bunkers, good luck, and let us know on Facebook or Twitter how you get on. But they're certainly worth having a look at, because, of course, this is important New Zealand ground. The New Zealanders did not participate in the Battle of Polygon Wood in 1917, but they occupied this ground through a large part of the early months of 1918. And so a very important site for the New Zealanders as well. So a great area to come together to remember those Anzac troops in Belgium.
Well, in fact, it's going to be the next thing we're going to walk to, because as we about face and move back to the ride, we carry on down and we're heading towards Butt's new British cemetery. In the old days, to get into the cemetery, you had to climb over the wall, and it was always a bit naughty. The Commonwealth War Graves didn't like you climbing over the wall, but it was really the only thing you could do. Other than that, you had a bit of a scramble to get round to the actual entrance. I think for a change, they totally recognised the need for a gate, and so we now thankfully have a gate that takes us into the cemetery. And the first thing that we see directly in front of us is, in fact, a New Zealand memorial. It is the memorial to the missing for this area.
Pete, so tell us about the nature of New Zealand memorials to the missing, because we're going to explore this one in detail. But the Kiwis took a different approach to their memorials, didn't they, than the British and the Australians and other members of the Commonwealth?
They did. The British do it slightly. We tend to, because of the numbers involved, it means that we needed more memorials to the missing. And so we sometimes have decided to produce the memorials on certain sites. Sometimes it's a single battlefield commemorating the missing from that battlefield. Sometimes it's time locked. So it's an area, but then it's a time as well. New Zealand went down that route, but then took it a step further. They decided that they would have a memorial to their missing from every battlefield that they fought on. And so there are multiple memorials to the New Zealand missing, always close to the action, and generally speaking, close to a memorial commemorating New Zealand in that area. And so there is fairly close. There is a New Zealand obelisk memorial as well. But here we have one very specific to the men fighting in 1917 and 1918 in the sector of the wood, so Polygon Wood. And their missing men are commemorated on the memorial within the confines of the cemetery.
It's really quite a beautiful memorial. It's like a low building almost with columns, and it's really quite lovely. It fits in very well with the design and layout of this entire cemetery. The cemetery, which we'll talk about in some more detail shortly, is an absolutely beautiful place, and I think this memorial is a real highlight of the visit there. Again, like all the New Zealand memorials, only one division of New Zealanders fought during the war, so I always like to say that the New Zealanders are probably the only country that doesn't claim that they won the war with their one division, but nevertheless a vital contribution played by the New Zealanders in the war, and they were some tough fighters. The Kiwis were tough fighters. The Germans never liked facing them, and this is a relatively small memorial compared to some of the other massive memorials to the missing. Only 378 men commemorated on it, but it does tell a story of some pretty tough Kiwi actions in this area, doesn't it, Pete?
It does indeed. It also has a secondary kind of usage as well as carrying the names of the missing and being a beautiful memorial to New Zealand. We have to think of the men that designed these cemeteries, and they're designing them with an element of practicality. And you have to think where this is. Well, the nearest town is a place called Zonnebeck, and it's quite some way away. So it means that you had either a walk, or you came in a taxi, or you came by a bus, or you came on a pushbike in some cases. But whatever way you came, you've then got a little walk into the wood, and what do you do if it's pouring with rain? And I'm sure that both Matt and myself have experienced this. It does pour with rain on a fairly regular basis, and you can shelter there. You can walk into the New Zealand Memorial, and these little asps, if that's the correct term, at each side. You can go in there. You can shake off your brolly and your coat, and have a bit of a chat and a warm up before you head out into the rain again. So it was designed for that. It was designed as a practical place as well. There are also seats within the cemetery, so it's something that a lot of people feel uncomfortable with. Is relaxing in these cemeteries. They feel like almost you have to have your head bowed and you have to be kind of fairly miserable. But that wasn't the intention when they built them. They built them with places where certainly the veterans that came back, the people that wanted to come and see where their comrades had died, or their relatives that came back, they wanted them to have that practicality of being able to sit down and perhaps have a flask of coffee and a sandwich while they were wanting to be close to their relatives or their mates. So it's something that we feel uncomfortable with now, but I don't. I think it's quite acceptable to have a coffee while you're, if you've got a flask with you, while you're walking around these cemeteries. So yeah, practicality in this New Zealand memorial to the missing as well.
It's a really important point, Pete, that as much as they realised they were building these cemeteries in perpetuity and that for centuries people would come and visit them, the reason they built these cemeteries was particularly so that grieving families from the UK, because obviously from Australia and New Zealand it was a bit far to come, but grieving families from the UK could come and visit their lost sons. So I always say to people, they didn't build these cemeteries for us. It's wonderful that we're now here remembering a century later, but they didn't build them for us. They built them for the grieving mothers and sisters and wives and children that came over from England as pilgrims in the 1920s to walk these cemeteries. And they were practical places. There were a lot of people that came over. They had to be practical. Transport was not good. Communication was not good. And as you say, they needed somewhere to sit. They needed somewhere to get out of the rain. They needed somewhere to warm up in winter. And so you see these elements built into the construction of the cemeteries. I think it's wonderful. The pilgrimages that were made in the 1920s, to me, are a separate but fascinating chapter of the history of the battlefields in just the same way the fighting is.
Oh, indeed, and we've just gone past the anniversary of one of the big pilgrimages. So I think it's important that we remember those. And I agree. I find them as interesting almost as the battlefield is these people returning, and how did they get there, and what did they do when they returned. And so it's a very, very moving aspect of the battlefields. I think is people returning and how they got about, how they visited, and what they did. I'm going to go off on a completely little tangent because I think it's just so interesting. A few years ago, in the middle of Ypres, on one of the rebuilt buildings, I found scratched into a brick the names and numbers of 2 Australian soldiers. And I've looked them up, and I think, how on earth did they get back? Because the cost of getting to the Western Front from Australia was prohibitive to a good 90% of the population cannot get back. But
not just the money as well, the time. If you imagine it was a 6-week sailing, 6 weeks each way plus the time you spent there meant it was effectively a 6-month trip you were going to take to Europe. Who could take time off from their job for 6 months in the 1920s?
Yep. And these 2 guys, which is the fascinating aspect, I thought perhaps they're Brits serving in the Australian forces, so maybe they stayed in Britain at the end of the war. But no, they didn't. They were Australians. They're born and bred in Australia. So somehow or other in the 1920s, they've come back and they've scratched their names. It's outside of a bar, as you'd expect. They've scratched their names into the brickworks outside of a bar. But I've looked at their service files. I can't see how they could afford. You have to think that they were maybe sailors. Maybe they came back, worked their ticket back across to Europe. I have no idea. But it's a great little bit of nuances of the battlefield that make it interesting. The other thing I just wanted to mention is we can see how important it was to the families in Australia who would never visit, because part of the documentation that went on with every family who had lost a relative, they received a little booklet which was explaining what the Imperial War Graves were doing and how their relatives would be commemorated. So they were aware that these relatives couldn't make that journey. It was too far and too costly and too much time. And so this little booklet was part of that compensation almost. Here's the booklet. Here you can actually see what we're doing and how the cemeteries will be created.
And if you're an Australian listening to this and you do make that wonderful journey to walk the battlefields, remember when you read those headstones of the boys from Ballarat and Bendigo and Wagga and all over Australia, that you are completing that pilgrimage that the families never got to. And so it's a really moving thing, I think, particularly for Australians. And a lot of the headstones with personal inscriptions from the families reflect the tyranny of distance, that they would never visit the grave. And in fact, it's probably a good segue that we're going to head into the cemetery now and walk through the Butts New British Cemetery. And the first grave on the far row on the left is one of my favourites. And when we talk of personal inscriptions, is one of the favourite inscriptions I've ever seen. Just absolutely heart-wrenching. It's not an Australian soldier, it's a British soldier. But the inscription says, "Tread softly, a mother's love lies here." And that to me sums up the entire reason for being for these cemeteries, a place of commemoration to remember lost sons and husbands. Just absolutely extraordinary. Pete, you must have seen some heart-wrenching inscriptions over the years.
I mean, truly terrible ones, and some very, very moving inscriptions as well. And it never ceases to amaze me how people reacted, really. And we can see, I can't instantly quote any, but I'm just going to give you a kind of a taster. You get some very vitriolic ones. You can see the families are not happy. They're not happy that their relative went to the war and died fighting for a cause perhaps that they didn't feel was necessary from an Australian perspective for their relative to have made that great journey and to have lost his life. And then we get the opposite. We get ones that are so heartbreaking. I mean, the ones that upset me the most, having children, are anything to do with children. You know, anything that is from the mother and baby so and so, and just very, very heartbreaking. I mean, there are several excellent books out on private epitaphs on the First World War cemeteries, and one of them actually has a link to an Australian. It's "In Fame's Eternal Camping Ground" is the title of the book, and that is part of an inscription on an Australian soldier who was awarded the Victoria Cross during the fighting at Passchendaele. And so that's an excellent book, well worth having a look at, and it's just full of very, very moving private inscriptions.
Well, there's a lot to read in this cemetery because it's a big one. This is a concentration cemetery, and when we say concentration, we mean graves were concentrated here from other sites in the area after the war. So this was not a cemetery that existed during the war. It was built after the war. And today there's 2,108 men buried or commemorated here, of which 564 are Australians. And as you would expect, Pete, from the fighting in this area, a lot of bodies being brought in after the war. More than 1,600 of those more than 2,000 graves are unidentified, just an extraordinary proportion. But graves from fighting across the entire gamut of battles in 1917 here.
It's extraordinary when you go up onto the butt, which we are going to do in a little while, and look down onto the cemetery, and you can see quite a lot of the headstones, and you just see over and over again that there's no name on there. They are unknown. It's because of the nature of the fighting here. So many men were buried where they fell and marked rudimentary, the old rifle and the helmet on the top, and very often the soldiers would scribble their names onto a little piece of paper, rolled it up and put it in their rifle sling. Where their rifle sling fastened, you could just slip it in there. How long is that going to last if that's the only indication of who's buried there? And that guy then is not going to be recovered, if recovered at all, for a couple of years. And by then it was almost impossible to identify them, and you were very lucky if you were able to be identified. So many are not. And well into the 1920s, they were recovering bodies. They still do. I don't know why I'm saying that, because they're still recovering, 100 maybe every year still to this day. Probably slightly less than that nowadays, but and that figure has not really dropped. It's not dropped since the 20s and 30s, and it's continued. So and perhaps is increasing at the moment because of expansion of building onto the battlefields, and that is causing us to find more bodies than we have in previous years. So it doesn't end. It's a very obvious cemetery. I use a little ditty when I'm walking in these cemeteries. If it's symmetrical, then you know it's a concentration cemetery. And I always say symmetry in the cemetery. If there's symmetry in the cemetery, it's concentration. It has to have been created after the war because it's been designed. Not just the walls and the buildings, but the graves, the layout of them. So one thing you can say here with absolute certainty is beneath every single headstone there is a soldier. Whether we know who he is or not, but beneath every headstone there is a soldier. And I'm just going to put a little extra bit of information on here, which I think is fascinating. The Commonwealth War Graves would not recover fragmentary remains. It didn't seem pointless, I suppose. I know it's a horrible thing to say, but why would you recover a hand of a soldier found in the fields by somebody ploughing or walking? Why would you recover a foot? Because, of course, the next week somebody could find another foot, and then what do? You end up with two burials that had both just... So they didn't recover fragmentary remains. But in this cemetery now, against if you're standing on the butt and looking towards the New Zealand Memorial, on the right-hand side there is a gravestone away from all the rest, and effectively it is for fragmentary remains. So the Commonwealth War Graves are now accepting the fragments of soldiers, very often found in archaeological work, very often found by people walking the battlefields. You can now hand those in, and they will be buried in this little area around this one headstone that is for fragmentary remains. So very moving, I find.
I think it's a wonderful innovation, because for decades I've been visiting the battlefields, and it's horrific, but you do find them. You find scraps of human remains lying around, individual bones and things, and you never knew what to do with them. I always just made a little hole and reburied them on the battlefield. But it's wonderful those are now being gathered up and reburied in the cemeteries. A couple of important graves to look out for here. Lieutenant Colonel Scott, that we mentioned earlier, from Scott Post, he is buried here. Not far away from him is Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Turnbull from the 20th Battalion of the Manchester Regiment. Now, there's a couple of funny stories about this, Pete. They were both killed at the same time, and there's a suggestion that they were killed during a handover, that as the Australians left, that the Manchester Regiment came in. Do you have anything to contribute to this, to rumours and mysterious stories about this?
Yeah, I think, again, it's like a lot of these stories, you have to be careful that you don't enhance something that's already been slightly enhanced. And I know that it sometimes spoils it, because for years I've told the story that these two died on the top of the mound, the butt, where we haven't mentioned it yet, but where the Australian 5th Divisional Memorial is. I'm not sure that's true, but I think they died together. They certainly, if they weren't quite on top of on the mound, they were close to it, and certainly they were definitely talking to each other. They were briefed. They were briefing each other, because they were handing over. The Australians were withdrawing. So Lieutenant Colonel Scott, DSO, Distinguished Service Order, and Lieutenant Colonel Dudley, also DSO, Distinguished Service Order, were discussing. I've just had one terrible aspect of this. Scott is 26 and Dudley was 25. So these are both men commanding battalions, both 26 and 25, so both very young men, and both also awarded the DSO, a Distinguished Service Order, so both had bravery awards. And one of the stories is that they were hit by the same bullet, and that story is sometimes enhanced a little more, that the bullet ricocheted off the ground and was not aimed at them. Which, whatever is the case, they were certainly side by side. They were certainly killed at the same time, whether it be the same bullet and whether it ricocheted or whether it just be a sniper that got them both. And so they both lie in the cemetery. So it's a very sad story because the Australians that were leaving that day, two commanding officers both lost not in a battle. And that's one of the other aspects of the fighting here. And I often get families who say this, well, my relative was killed on the 27th of September. That wasn't the battle. There was no battle going on there. Well, of course there was. The fighting continues. It's just that we are not attempting to advance on the 27th. We're actually reorganising, holding our positions and preparing for the next push, which will be Broodsind in a few days after. So the fighting doesn't really go away. So the chances of being killed not on the actual battle day are almost as high. And it's by actions like this, by the randomness of the Great War. And these two guys, sadly, that's what happened to them.
Much more likely, I think, that they were killed by a shell would be a much more likely scenario, that they were together handing over and a shell landed and killed them both, because shells often killed, many people at a time. So, but either way, the evidence suggests they were killed together and are now buried not far from each other in the cemetery. Also, while you're in the cemetery, look out for the Zonnebeek Five, or the Westhoek Five, as they're also known, the soldiers that were uncovered and that I was fortunate to get to know during that documentary Lost in Flanders. So that's Jack Hunter, John Calder and George Story are the three soldiers that were identified out of the five and lie together in a plot where they were reburied in 2007. So just a remarkable story. Their names are still on the Menin Gate, memorial to the missing, but they also have now a named headstone in this cemetery. So just a really wonderful place. And we are now going to leave the cemetery and climb up onto the Butts, which overlooks the cemetery, and head up to the 5th Australian Divisional Memorial. Peter, a remarkable spot on the battlefields and one of the 5 Australian Divisional memorials on the Western Front.
It is. It's a beautiful memorial and enhanced by the height, by being on top of the butt. The others are not quite as enhanced. The other 4. We have one. I'll just add this little bit of information. It's just an interesting by the by. 5 divisions, should be 5 obelisks, all exactly the same. But one of them, the 2nd Division, decided to do something else. I won't discuss it further because I'm sure it'll come into one of our future podcasts. So we only have 4 of these, 4 looking exactly the same and designed by the commander of the 5th Division. He will eventually be a Sir, Lieutenant General Sir Joseph John Hobbs. And he was commanding the 5th Division, but he's an architect in civilian life. He was an architect, and I think he was very keen to be involved in the designing of the memorials commemorating the Australian effort on the Western Front. And so it's his design that is going to be used for those 4 divisional memorials, and this being his own division. So this is the one that I always talk about, John Hobbs here. Emblazoned with the rising sun on the front in bronze, and the memorial itself is made out of a bluestone. It was going to be originally, the idea was that it would actually be shipped from Australia, but it was found that it was going to be too costly and take too long, and so they looked for a stone that was as near as they could get to Australian bluestone, and it's not a bad effort.
It's interesting that the other divisional memorials, the 1st Division is at Pozières, the 2nd at Mont-Saint-Quentin, the 3rd at Sally-le-Sec on the Somme, the 4th at Bellinglees, way out in the Aisne region, and then the 5th Division memorial here at Polygon Wood, each marking the site of a significant action as chosen by the division. And they're quite remarkable. They also include the battle honours of the divisions where they fought. And I think that tells an interesting story in its own right, because the 5th Division memorial, the first battle honour on this memorial is Fromelles. And we don't often see Fromelles listed anywhere as a battle honour. I mean, go back to our first episode of this podcast series and listen to our walk around the disastrous Australian battlefield of Fromelles. But it's not often, Pete, that you see Fromelles mentioned anywhere as a battle honour.
It's not even on the National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux. You'd expect it to be on there, but it's not even on there. Fromelles is not mentioned, so it is extraordinary. I think this is the only place you will find it, certainly on the battlefield. One of the aspects of building these memorials was that they are on significant sites, but never a significant site that is just a disaster. Because several people have asked me over the years why is this memorial not on Fromelles? Well, there's nothing laudable on the Fromelles battlefield. It's a total disaster, no gain, pointless. And so it was decided not to build the memorial there, even though that's where the worst casualties of the whole of the war will take place for the 5th Division in that one-day action. And this was fairly heavy casualties, but it was decided that this was a very successful action, part of the Third Battle of Ypres. And so, I think it was a correct decision to build it here. Interestingly, Talbot Hobbs is from Perth, and there's a beautiful statue of him. I've not actually seen it in real life, as they say. It recently moved. It used to be close to the quay, I think, and now it's in Supreme Court Gardens in Perth, and that's his home city. Well, actually, he's a Brit. He was actually born in and educated in Britain, but set up an architect's practice in Perth, and that's where he's remembered.
I think, didn't he die in some unusual circumstances as well?
He did indeed. Very sad. I don't know why I'm sniggering, because it's terrible, really. He was on a ship on the way back to France, actually, for the unveiling of the memorial at Villers-Bretonneux, the Australian National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux, and he actually died on board the ship when he was heading to take part in the service commemorating Australian effort on the Western Front with the unveiling of the Australian National Memorial. So he didn't make it, sadly.
Ironic that he didn't make the opening of that memorial. Very sad, a sad footnote to that tale.
It is, yeah.
We're going to walk down off the butts now. We're going to walk out of Polygon Wood Cemetery, and directly across the road, the butts links very neatly to another little cemetery that's across the road. One of my favourites on the Western Front, Polygon Wood Cemetery. It's a battlefield cemetery constructed during the war. It's a little Anzac cemetery. Most of the burials there are Australians or New Zealanders. And just a really interesting spot to visit, Pete. And you can tell the difference between the huge, well-organised concentration cemetery across the road and this tiny little battlefield cemetery, obviously constructed during the war.
It's a real good juxtaposition, and if you're talking cemeteries, which I quite often am, then this is the right place to be, because you've got the enormous Butts Cemetery, which is planned and designed and is perfect in its layout. And here we have the Polygon Wood Cemetery, which is oddly outside of the wood, but it's random. The graves are facing different directions. There's small groups. There's individuals. There's even a German burial in there, which is quite interesting. And so when was it created? Well, it was created immediately after the fighting takes place. And so these guys are brought in and buried here. Now, what's unusual about that is that we don't do it. It's too dangerous. This area was so dangerous that, as I said, people were buried individually. There are very few battlefield cemeteries because that's what this is. So it's very unusual. And I often wondered why it's there. Why would you put a battlefield cemetery just beside the wood? And it becomes fairly obvious once you know that there was once, it's no longer there, but there was once another cemetery there. And that was a German cemetery. Created after the fighting in 1915, when the Germans forced us off these ridges. And so it was already existing. And this is very common, is that if we then take a landscape and there's already a military cemetery there, we very often bury our dead in the enemy's cemetery. And that's exactly what happened here. When we cleared the ridge, cleared the woods, pushed the Germans far enough back where we could actually just gather together a few people, as was said, only 107 people buried here. But they brought them in alongside this pre-existing German cemetery. Now, what is the sad aspect of all of this is it's no longer there. The German cemetery was actually removed in the 1950s, at a time when it was felt after the Second World War and the horror of the occupation. A lot of people just didn't really want Germans to be buried anywhere in Belgium. And it was decided that perhaps the best thing to do would be to concentrate them. And the Germans were exhumed from their various small cemeteries, because this was not a big cemetery. And eventually they are going to be concentrated, sadly, in mass graves, and in this case at Langemark, which is a village on the other side of the salient. We'll cover it, I'm sure, in another podcast. And the German cemetery there now contains a very big mass grave of soldiers gathered from this area. And so I don't like it, I have to say, and I often make my feelings known when I'm here, because I think it's a great shame, because I think it would have enhanced the battlefield and gave you that juxtaposition of seeing, well, there's the enemy buried and there's our burials here, and they're side by side. But no, they were moved in the 1950s. It's quite late. I think it was 57 when that one was actually shut down and removed.
It's when you look at trench maps of the time, you will see a cemetery marked on the trench maps, even before the fighting in 1917, and that's the German cemetery that you mentioned. It's not the current Polygon Wood cemetery that is there today. But I agree. I think it was a great injustice to the Germans who lay in that cemetery. And at the end of the day, politics aside and diplomacy aside, it's the poor blokes in the front line on either side that are paying the price for these huge wars. So I agree. It was a sad chapter for Belgium to make that decision. But that's as it is. That brings us to the end of our walking tour of Polygon Wood, a wonderful battlefield, always one that I enjoy getting back to. It tells an incredible story. It was one of the first ones I visited. And Pete, thank you so much. I learned a lot during this walk that I didn't know about Polygon Wood, so thank you very much for your wonderful insights into this battlefield.
No, it's a pleasure, Matt. It's one that I enjoy as well because of that differences, the different cemeteries, the blockhouses. There's so much to look at in one very small area.
Well, thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure.